In southeast Holland, nothing lay between the British Army and the German plain except 2 rivers and a town.
Unfortunately for the Allied forces taking part in the operation, there was more than just 2 rivers and a town between 21st Army Group and the crossing of the Rhine. 2 SS Panzer divisions stood in the way. This is Operation Market Garden. Strategic situation. After the breakout of the Allies from Normandy in August 1944, they rapidly advanced toward the German border and into Belgium. The port of Antwerp, crucial to bringing in supplies for the advancing Allied forces, was captured after a sharp, quick fight. Its approaches were not captured, but we will come back to that later. It is with this situation in September 1944, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of 21st Army Group, had decided on a bold strike to advance into Germany. He devised a plan to outflank the defenses of the Siegfried Line, called the West Wall by the Germans, by advancing over 3 natural water barriers that protected Germany's northwestern flank. The plan called for airborne forces to capture bridges over the Maas at Grave, the Wall at Nijmegen, and the Niederrhein, or Lower Rhine in English, at Arnhem. These positions were to be secured by an armored column advancing from the south. Once these positions were secured, they would be used to make a major advance eastward into the Ruhr Valley, the German industrial heartland. Montgomery was able to convince Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower that his plan could end the war faster, and thus Ike gave his support for Operation Market Garden. Before moving into the discussion of the preparations for Market Garden, I want to say thank you to Dan McGrew of Lancaster, Ohio, for helping to make this video possible. Preparation. Operation Market Garden, as you can probably tell from its name, was made up of 2 groups. Market was the airborne element of the operation, while Garden was the land portion. Units of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, placed under the command of Montgomery and the 21st Army Group, were tasked with securing the various river crossings needed for the success of Market Garden. 30 Corps of the British Second Army was to advance along the corridor, which the airborne forces would open for them. The Corps had gathered along the Belgian-Dutch border just prior to the beginning of the operation. According to Montgomery's plan, the 30 Corps would need 48 hours to advance through Eindhoven, Zahn, Wegel, Grave, Nijmegen, and finally to Arnhem, a distance of 100 kilometers, or about 63 miles. When 30 Corps reached Arnhem, it was to move to the east and hold the position to allow further advances into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. Intelligence. Before we move into the operation itself, it is best we discuss the Allied intelligence efforts related to Market Garden. There is much debate about if Market Garden was unsuccessful because of an intelligence failure. Simply put, no, the operation did not fail because of a lack of intelligence. A lack of the proper use of intelligence was one of the reasons for the failure. The senior Allied commanders knew that the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were located near Arnhem. The enemy was dismissed as unwilling to fight after the Allied breakout from Normandy. The presence of German armor was known, and yet the lightly armed paratroopers were sent into action against them. This was one of the major mistakes of the campaign. Lack of knowledge about the ground that 30 Corps was to advance over was another major problem for Operation Market Garden. The intelligence on the terrain provided by the Dutch underground was largely ignored by the Market Garden planners. The road network between the Belgian border and Arnhem was limited by a patchwork of plotters, which are low-lying fields that have been drained and reclaimed from the sea for agricultural use, dikes, elevated roadways, and easily defended waterways. Soft, wet soil limited armor movement to along the elevated roads. This would slow 30 Corps' advance, along with the resistance put up by the Germans, to who our attention will now turn. German forces. The Germans facing the Allies in the Netherlands were under the command of Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B. Under his command, Model had the forces of General Kurt Student's 1st Parachute Army and General Gustav von Zagen's 15th Army. These forces would defend the area around Nijmegen. The 15th Army was able to escape from the south banks of the Scheldt due to the stop of the Allied advance that took place in anticipation of Operation Market Garden. Leaving some units to hold the south bank of the Scheldt, which we will return to later, Zagen began to ferry the bulk of his army across the estuary to escape and join the rest of the German forces in the Netherlands. 2 SS Panzer Corps was located around Arnhem while resting and refitting after the fighting in Normandy. The 2 divisions that made up the Corps were the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. Scratch rear echelon formations, the infamous Kids and Old Men, were also part of the German forces in the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden begins. On 17th September 1944, Operation Market Garden began. It lasted until September 25th, when the remaining elements of the British 1st Airborne Division retreated across the Rhine into Allied positions. Airborne Drops. Aircraft and gliders from the 38th and 46th Groups, Royal Air Force, and the 9th U.S. Troop Carrier Command carried the paratroopers and glider troops to their drop and landing zones. Due to a shortage of aircraft, the airborne troops were flown into the Netherlands in several lifts. Also, drop and landing zones were located far away from the bridges to avoid German anti-aircraft concentrations. 30 Corps advance. 30 Corps advance began from the general line of the Albert Canal near Nieuwpoort, Belgium. The advance was on a very narrow front, with only one road most of the way. The divisions of 30 Corps were the Guards Armored Division, the 43rd Wessex Infantry Division, and the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division. The Guards Armored Division was the spear point of the advance, with the Irish Guards in the lead. The success or failure of the entire operation relied upon this division reaching Arnhem to support the British Airborne before they could no longer resist the Germans. The distance of the 30 Corps start line to Eindhoven was 20 kilometers or 13 miles. The advance began at 14:35 hours with a heavy artillery bombardment and aircraft attacks to clear the way. The attack initially went well, but began to stall due to enemy resistance. The Irish Guards reached Vulcan's Wood at last light on the 17th. Project 44 is a great resource with lots of maps connected to the Second World War. I've linked it down below so you can check it out for yourself. I want to say thank you for the permission to use their maps for this video. 30 Corps' attack resumed at 600 hours on the 18th, but was again met by German resistance, slowing the advance. They reached Eindhoven on the second day of the operation. The cheering people of the city celebrated the arrival of their liberators, but also slowed their advance. The Irish Guards were able to link up with the 101st Airborne around noon, 18 hours behind schedule. I will discuss the remainder of 30 Corps' participation in Market Garden when discussing the various airborne divisions and the fighting for the bridges. Eindhoven and Zahn. The US 101st Airborne landed north of Eindhoven at Zahn on 17th September. At 1300 hours, the 101st Airborne was firmly established at Zahn and west of Vegel. Bridge at Zahn had been blown before the 506th Regiment was able to capture it. The airborne engineers had to wait for the arrival of 30 Corps engineers before a Bailey Bridge could be put in place so the advance could continue. British and American engineers worked throughout the night of the 18th, 19th to complete the bridge. At 800 hours on the 19th, the first tanks crossed the bridge. Despite the Irish Guards reaching Eindhoven, the corridor connecting it to the start line was cut by German tanks and infantry in several places along the route. Fighting was difficult as the 101st Airborne struggled to keep the road open among German counterattacks. This route later became known as Hell's Highway. Nijmegen. On 17 September, the American 82nd Airborne Division landed near Nijmegen at the nearby villages of Grave and Groesbeek. The bridge at Grave was taken on the 17th. The advances toward the bridge at Nijmegen were stopped by the Germans on the 17th and 18th. On 19 September, the tanks of the 30 Corps made contact with 82nd Airborne units in Grave. A combined attack to secure the bridge at Nijmegen was made, but failed. By this time, the German forces in Nijmegen had received reinforcements from the 10th SS Panzer Division and put up stiff resistance. On the 20th, the bridge was attacked from both sides at the same time. Units from the 82nd Airborne crossed the Wall River in small rafts under heavy enemy fire. They managed to establish a beachhead on the northern bank of the Wall. The 82nd Airborne attacked the elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division who were stalling the British advance at the Nijmegen Bridge. With the Americans crossing the river and the British tanks advancing on them, the Germans pulled back from the bridge. With the Nijmegen Bridge in Allied hands, the tanks of 30 Corps were only 14 kilometers, or 8.5 miles, away from the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Arnhem. The 1st British Airborne Division's landing and drop zones were 11 kilometers, or 7 miles, away from the bridge at Arnhem. Due to the shortage of aircraft, the division was flown in on 3 lifts spread over 3 days. As a result, only half of the 1st Airborne were flown to Arnhem on the first day on the 17th. After landing, only the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Parachute Brigade, under the command of Colonel John Frost, succeeded in reaching the bridge at Arnhem. They were only able to capture the northern end, but believed they could hold it until the rest of the division, where the tanks of 30 Corps, arrived. Throughout the 18th, the remainder of the 1st Parachute Brigade fought to reach the bridge, but only got within 1 mile, and took heavy casualties in the process. No further attacks could take place. This is what the John Frost Bridge looks like today. It's not the original bridge, as it was destroyed later on during the war by the Allies to deny its use to the Germans. The Germans launched heavy and repeated infantry and tank attacks against the British paratroopers in the buildings around the bridge, but failed to dislodge them. On the 19th, the Germans shifted their tactics and started a heavy artillery barrage over the area occupied by Frost's men in an attempt to blow them out of their positions by systematically demolishing the buildings they occupied. Infantry and tank attacks continued, but they were repulsed just like the earlier ones. By 20 September, the paratroopers were running low on ammunition. One by one, their positions began to fall to German attacks. Their entire defense collapsed on the 21st, when Frost and his remaining men surrendered. On 20 September, at the divisional headquarters in Oosterbeek, the decision was made to abandon the 2nd Battalion at the Arnhem Bridge, fortify the remaining troops of the division into a defensive perimeter around the town of Oosterbeek. 21st, the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade entered the battle. Most of the brigade was dropped south of the Rhine near the village of Driel. The Poles attempted to cross the river to help relieve the 1st Airborne multiple times, but were unsuccessful. Germans launched costly attacks against the position of the Oosterbeek perimeter, but achieved little. Just like at Arnhem Bridge, they used artillery to constantly bombard the 1st Airborne, but the attacks failed to dislodge the paratroopers. The first tanks of 30 Corps began to arrive on the opposite side of the 1st Airborne's bridgehead on the night of the 22nd, over 3 days late. The tanks could not cross the river to relieve the paratroopers. Operation Market Garden had failed. Realizing the situation, High Command ordered the 1st British Airborne Division to retreat to the south bank of the Rhine. On the night of 24-25 September, the retreat began. Codenamed Operation Berlin, 2,100 troops were either ferried back on boats or swam across the Rhine. Canadian and British engineers played a key role in evacuating the paratroopers across the river. 300 men remained on the north bank when the retreat was halted. The British had flown into Arnhem with 10,000 men, but after 9 days of combat, they came out with little more than 2,000.
The guns died out in Arnhem. Then we knew the greatest gallantry was not enough to cross the final bridge. And now no choice remained to us. Direct assault against the Siegfried Line would be the only way to carve our corridors into the Reich. But first a port was needed for supplies. Antwerp we had, but thundering German guns controlled the 30 cold miles of the Scheldt from Antwerp to the sea.
The failure of Operation Market Garden. It is at this point that videos on Operation Market Garden usually end, but I want to take this one step a little further. Let's talk about 2 direct consequences of Market Garden's failure. One on the people of the Netherlands, and the other on the Allied troops. The Hunger Winter.
Into the Allied net also falls one of the worst of all Nazi murderers, Seyss-Inquart, former Chancellor of Austria, Deputy Governor of Poland, and then Reich Commissar to the Netherlands.
The Dutch Hunger Winter of 1944-45 was a severe food crisis that developed as a result of Operation Market Garden. In September 1944, the Dutch government in exile wanted to help the Allies with Market Garden. As a result, they called for a railway strike in the occupied Netherlands. It was believed the strike would limit German mobility and therefore limit their ability to counterattack the Allies. The Dutch underground enthusiastically followed the order. Within one single day, the majority of the railroad personnel disappeared underground. All traffic by train stopped, and the Germans had to get personnel from Germany to fill the gaps. In retaliation for the railroad strike, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the German Reichskommissar for the Netherlands, placed an embargo on all inland shipping. This made it impossible to transport food from the farms in the northeast to the largely urban population in the western part of the country. Inland shipping was reinstated after 6 weeks, but the damage was done. Producers and distributors held onto food because they feared the Germans would confiscate it. Furthermore, until February 1945, freezing temperatures made it very difficult to transport supplies via the country's canal system. Together, these factors caused a severe food shortage in the western part of the Netherlands. With so little food available, some people resorted to eating pets, animal feed, such as sugar beets, and flower bulbs. Here's a recipe for tulip bulb puree provided by a department store. Starving citizens made long trips to the agrarian northeast to buy food direct from farmers. Families sold jewelry and other luxury goods just to survive. The situation was so bad that 40 to 50,000 children were evacuated to the northeast. Not only food was lacking during the Hunger Winter, the coal supplies that kept stoves and central heating burning were also practically gone. Many city parks lost their trees in this period, as people used them for wood to keep warm. Initial relief for the starving Dutch came from Allied airborne drops of food. Operation Manna was the Royal Air Force-led action to airdrop food. It was named after the food that was miraculously provided to the Israelites in the Book of Exodus. A plan to bring in food by air was developed after pressure from the Dutch royalty on President Franklin Roosevelt. He gave General Eisenhower permission to contact Seyss-Inquart and negotiate a ceasefire, and one was reached. Manna began on 29 April 1945. The Germans agreed to several locations where the food could be dropped. Almost 535 tons of food were dropped on the first day alone. Baskets were dropped from bombers without parachutes. The drops continued for several days afterwards, with hundreds of tons being dropped each day. Operation Chowhound was the American dropping of food. Chowhound lasted from 1 May to the 8th. The Americans made over 2,200 flights and dropped 3,700 tons of food. On a further meeting on 30 April, both sides decided that transport by air alone would not bring in enough food. A ground operation, codenamed Faust, was launched. 200 Allied trucks from the 21st Army Group would bring food to Rhenen, starting 2 May. Once the trucks reached Rhenen, they would hand over the food to Dutch truck drivers, who would take the food further into German-occupied territory. Operation Faust ran from 2 May to the 9th, and delivered between 840 and 1,141 tons of food and supplies per day. On 5 May, the Germans in the Netherlands surrendered. The Allies could reach all of the country with food deliveries. By the time the Netherlands were liberated in May 1945, around 20,000 people had died from starvation and malnutrition. The Battle of the Scheldt. Talked about earlier in the video, the approaches to Antwerp had not been taken when the city itself was captured. Operation Market Garden took precedence for supplies and troops, thus delaying 1st Canadian Army's ability to clear the approaches to the city. The clearing of the Scheldt was needed, as the Allies still lacked a serviceable deepwater port to supply their armies fighting into Germany. What followed is known as the Battle of the Scheldt. I've linked a playlist down below with a variety of videos and discussions about the battle and the clearing of the estuary of naval mines. The terrain was flat, muddy, and flooded, with much of it below sea level and plotters. Canals and dikes were further obstacles that slowed the Allied advance. Armored vehicles became stuck in the mud, and the attackers had to travel along exposed narrow roads built on the tops of the dikes. German defenders sighted their machine guns and artillery along these avenues of advance and caused extensive Allied casualties. Operations in the Scheldt began in early October 1944. Securing access to South Bavelen and taking the island itself was assigned to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. The fighting was incredibly difficult. For example, on 13 October, the Black Watch lost 145 men on what became known as Black Friday. Simultaneously, Operation Switchback cleared out the remnants of the German 15th Army and the Breskens Pocket on the mainland. Walcheren Island at the mouth of the Scheldt was the last major obstacle to the estuary being in Allied hands. The island had been heavily fortified and was difficult to attack. The Royal Air Force therefore bombed the dikes, flooding the area and allowing an amphibious assault on the island. The only land approach was a long, narrow causeway. The land surrounding it were too wet to cross by foot, but the water was too shallow to cross by boat. The Allies launched a 3-pronged assault and captured the island after difficult fighting and many casualties. By late November 1944, all the mines had been cleared from the Scheldt River. On 28 November, the first Allied convoy entered the port of Antwerp. The Allies suffered heavily in the Scheldt, with nearly 13,000 casualties during the battle, including more than 6,300 Canadians. Operation Market Garden Assessment. Operation Market Garden was a daring plan that could have ended World War II early. However, due to a variety of factors, this was not to be. Ignoring credible intelligence, relying on a limited advance through a narrow corridor, and dropping airborne troops too far away from their objectives contributed to the operation's failure. Casualty estimates for all the forces involved in Market Garden vary. The Allied casualties, that includes killed, captured, and wounded, are estimated to be between 15,000 and 17,000. German casualties are probably somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000. Also, 500 Dutch civilians were killed as a result of the fighting. I've linked some resources in the description down below for you to learn more about Operation Market Garden. Now check out this discussion I had with historian Mark Zilke about Canada's Battle of the Scheldt.